Hello and welcome to your video lecture on Chapter 12, where we're going to discuss some of the basics of the nervous system and nervous tissue. So we'll start off with section 12.1 on the basic structure and function of the nervous system. Our nervous system has a couple components that are going to consist of the brain, spinal cord, these peripheral nerves, and also receptors. And we can subdivide our nervous system into two main systems. First, we have our central nervous system, which I'll refer to as CNS, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. And as you can see, this is in the center of our body. It's central, right? So it fits within the nervous system name. And then we have our peripheral nervous system, or PNS. And this will consist of the sensory receptors we have throughout our body and these peripheral nerves. Now let's talk a little bit about the central nervous system some more. We said it consists of the brain, and this is going to be contained within the cranial cavity of the skull. Our spinal cord is going to be contained within the vertebral cavity of the vertebral column. And we have these two special terms that are only referred to in the central nervous system. Now this term nucleus you have heard before. You probably are thinking of a nucleus inside of a cell, or if you have more of a chemistry type of brain, you might think of the nucleus inside of an atom. But when we talk about a nucleus in the central nervous system, we are talking about localized areas where we have a collection of neuron cell bodies. So when we look at this slice of the brain, so basically I've kind of sliced the brain like this, you are going to see these darker pigmented areas here. This is where the collection of those cell bodies are found. So we would refer to these as a nucleus. And the other term is tract, and this is just a bundle of axons or fibers found in the central nervous system. So I'll refer back to tracts in just a little bit. First, let's talk about some of the cells we find within our nervous system. We have our glial cells, or sometimes these are called neuroglia, and these cells are going to help to support and protect our neurons. Our principal cell in nervous tissue are the neurons, or nerve cells, and these are going to receive stimuli and transmit action potentials or nerve impulses, and their organization is pretty basic here. We've got our cell body, or this is also termed a soma, and then we have the dendrites that stick out. So there are these extensions here that are the dendrites, and these dendrites are receiving the input. And lastly, we have the axon here, and this is where the output of information is going to flow. So just a little bit more detail in this slide, but we are going to go into even more detail on the neuron structure in section 12.2. So we see our neuron cell body here, and it is going to consist of an actual cell nucleus here, and then we have something called nissal substance. This is the nerve cell's rough endoplasmic reticulum. And then extending out of the cell body, of course, we mentioned these dendrites. These are short, and you could see they're highly branched, and they're going to receive the input from other neurons to transmit information down this axon. So this axon can also branch out, and this is called a collateral axon, in order to have information travel to different areas. A axon is also going to have this beginning portions. We have the axon hillock, in which we're going to have the flow of information first go there, and then into the initial segment. This is the beginning of the axon. So you could see that our axon hillock and the initial segment create our trigger zone, and this is the site where action potentials are generated. And the axon hillock and part of the axon are going to be nearest the cell body. As we continue down the axon, we are going to head over to these presynaptic terminals, or these are also called terminal boutons or Another term is axon terminal. So lots of different names for the ends of the neuron here. And in these terminal regions, we are going to find synaptic vesicles. They're basically like little Tupperwares for these chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters. So now let's jump back into talking about some of the anatomy within our nervous systems. In regions that are predominantly going to consist of cell bodies and regions that largely are composed of axons, we are going to use two separate terms for this. Our first term is gray matter. So you can see this pictured over here where they've taken a little slice of this brain. And in this region, we will find cell bodies and dendrites of our neurons. Now this area that is white is called white matter, and these are regions with many axons. And these axons are special because they're insulated with a lipid-rich substance called myelin. And the reason we see it turn white is because lipids appear white. Think of it as fat. So when you are cutting fat, let's say off a steak or off a chicken breast, it has that white appearance to it. Now let's talk a little bit about our peripheral nervous system, or PNS. We are going to receive information for our peripheral nervous system through sensory receptors. So an example with this in this image is going to be the eye. We are getting sensory input through the eye, and we have neurons in the eye that are going to be separate but specialized cells that detect specific things. So in the eye, of course, this is going to be light, but in other parts of the body, it could be temperature, pain, touch, pressure, sound, or odors. And then we have nerves. And I'll just use this nerve as an example here. This is going to be a bundle of axons, and they're sheets that connect the central nervous system to the sensory receptors, muscles, and glands. And in our peripheral nervous system, we have two sets of nerves. We have our cranial nerves, which just means that the nerves are coming off of the brain, and we have 12 total pairs of these. And the other nerves we have are spinal nerves, and these are going to originate from the spinal cord, and we have 31 pairs of those. And then we have these two special terms over here specific for peripheral nervous systems. So first one is a ganglion. This is going to be, and it's pictured here, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, or you could say inside the peripheral nervous system. Now this portion of the definition should sound familiar. This is essentially the same thing, except that this is found in the peripheral nervous system. If we found a collection of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system, then we would use the term nucleus, right? Do you recall that? And so here, if we look at the spinal cord, that's a part of our central nervous system, right? But this ganglion that is pictured over here and here, that is found outside of the spinal cord. And so we can see, if we look at this zoomed in version, all of these little cell bodies in here that would serve as a part of the ganglion. Now, another term we use for the peripheral nervous system is plexus. And this is going to be defined as an extensive network of axons, and sometimes the neuron cell bodies that are located outside of the central nervous system. So an example of this would be our lumbosacral plexus here. You can see it's coming off of the spinal cord. We have all these different spinal nerves here that are creating a network or a braid. It's very complex in here, in order to come together and finally create these terminal nerves. So this area is the plexus. Specifically, this one is the lumbosacral plexus. And just so we're clear, we wanted to compare the terms tract and nerve. So in the central nervous system, we would use the term tract, which is a bundle of axons. But if it's found in the peripheral nervous system, then we use the term nerve, which is also a bundle of axons. So the best way to demonstrate this is by looking at some of the neurons or axons for our eyes. So here we have our eye, and this area is representing our retina, and all of those neurons are coming together and creating an optic nerve. So this is located outside of that central nervous system. So that's why it's called nerve, because it's in our peripheral nervous system. And then notice these neurons, they come back and they're crisscrossing in certain areas. Some of them stay on the same side. But now we are starting to enter into the central nervous system, into the brain. And that's why after they go through this crossing, they term this region where we have a bundle of axons an optic tract. Okay, still a bundle of axons, it's just found in the CNS. And now let's talk about some basic functions of our nervous system. We've seen this photo before, but I want to go through, and in your guided notes you are going to label each of these. So first we need to talk about sensory or afferent neurons. These are going to be action potentials that are traveling through this neuron and they're moving toward the central nervous system. So this is our sensory input here. Then we are going to reach the central nervous system, and in here we are going to find neurons that are interneurons or association neurons. And these are basically just communicating from one neuron to another. And lastly, we have our motor or efferent neurons, where we have action potentials moving away from the central nervous system. So B is going to be integration, and C is going to be our motor output. Now, a good way, in case you're mixing up afferent and efferent, a good way to memorize which is which is to think of the word same. So S-A, getting a little sloppy in my writing here, S-A-M-E. So I just kind of imagine a slash in here. So that reminds me sensory is afferent and motor is efferent. Now let's talk about controlling the body, and basically we are going to discuss the different divisions of our peripheral nervous system in order to understand how we are controlling the body. So the first main divisions is a sensory or afferent division, which discusses the transmission of action potentials from a receptor to the central nervous system. So for example, let's imagine there's like a little pin here. We would have a receptor pick up that painful stimuli and send it along its sensory neuron into the central nervous system. So that's what we're talking about, sensory information coming in. And then here we have our motor or efferent division. So here we are going to start off in the central nervous system, but now these action potentials are being transmitted away and going over to an effector. So what I mean by an effector or a target gland maybe is that it's either going to some type of muscle, skeletal, cardiac, or smooth, or it's going to go to a gland, whether that's endocrine or exocrine. And so we are going to focus on the peripheral nervous system's motor division now. So within that motor division, meaning we are sending action potentials away from the central nervous system and toward a target organ. First, we have our somatic nervous system. So again, from the central nervous system to, in this case, will be skeletal muscle specifically. This system is going to be voluntary, and you know this. We control our skeletal muscle through conscious thought, and we use a single neuron system. So we start off here in the spinal cord, and this neuron is exiting on out and going to that skeletal muscle, telling it to contract. Now, in order to do this, and you may remember this from our muscular system, we are going to have at this axon terminal here these synaptic vesicles that are going to release a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical signaler, over to receptors on another neuron, or in our case, it's going to be our skeletal muscle. And when we have that process take place where that neurotransmitter is moving across and conveying information to another structure, this is called a synapse, where we have a nerve cell to another cell. Now let's talk about our other nervous system in the motor division, which is the autonomic nervous system. This is our nervous system that sends information from our central nervous system, which we see over here, to either smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, or it's going to be certain glands. So this could be to like the adrenal glands on the kidneys or something like that. Now, this nervous system is subconscious or involved in involuntary control, so we cannot consciously think to stimulate this. And we have two neuron systems. Our first neuron is going to, and I think I'm going to use this one as our example. So we've got two neurons here. Our first neuron is leaving the central nervous system, so the brain here, and it travels over to a ganglion. Now remember what ganglion meant? It meant a collection of cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system. And there we are going to synapse with a second neuron from the that'll leave the ganglion and travel over to our effector organ. So there are two neurons. That's what we mean by a two neuron system. And by the way, these are going to be motor neurons, right? And then we have further subdivisions of our autonomic nervous system. We have our sympathetic nervous system, and this is going to prepare our body for physical activity. So whenever you think sympathetic, I want you to think this is our fight or flight response. So fight meaning you are going to send blood over to your muscles. Maybe you're going to increase heart rate, increase your respiratory rate in order to prepare to fight or flight, to run away. And then we have your parasympathetic nervous system. This is going to help regulate our resting or vegetative functions, such as digesting food or emptying the urinary bladder. So hopefully you are sitting down and comfortable listening to this lecture. Your parasympathetic nervous system is triggered here. And this is going to be known as our rest and digest response. Now, the last division is our enteric nervous system. And here we have plexuses, or really this term should be plexi for multiple plexuses. And we're going to find these within the walls of our digestive tract. Now, we haven't talked about the digestive tract walls just yet, but know that we are going to have layers of different tissues that make up that tube, like think the esophagus or the intestines. And the food is going to make its first contact with this mucosa. So here in this space, we can write lumen. This is the space where our food is traveling. And as we're moving through the walls, we have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis propria or muscularis externa, and then a serosa or adventitia layer. Now, the only reason I'm telling you about these layers is because within the submucosa and the muscularis propria, we have these plexi of nerves here that belong to this enteric nervous system. Through these plexi, we can have the digestive tract kind of independently control itself, but it's still considered a part of our autonomic nervous system because our parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons are going to contribute to these plexi. And here is a nice photo showing you that two neuron system. There's our first neuron, which typically we call a presynaptic neuron, meaning it's the first one that travels through. And then here is where our synapse is going to take place in an autonomic ganglion. And here's our second motor neuron, which is also called a postsynaptic neuron. Now let's talk about an everyday connection here. How much of our brain do we really use? So you may have heard that we typically use only 10% of our brain, but that is simply not true. And the way that scientists figured this out is by taking measurements of our brain activity during specific tasks, and they used something called a functional magnetic resonance imaging in order to do this, so fMRI. And so what that does is gives us images of a map of the most active areas in 3D. And active nervous tissue will have greater blood flow that we can follow. So in this photo here, you could see that we have portions of the brain that are lighting up here. They asked the patient to decipher, well, first they had the patient kind of look at a black dot in the center of a screen, and then they would change pictures kind of on the side of that dot of either a picture of someone that they knew or someone they did not know. And if they knew them, they had to give a thumbs up. If they didn't know them, thumbs down. And so what they saw is, as a person was going through these different photos, we saw that there were visual sensory areas lighting up, showing that it was active, and also some motor regions in which they would have to raise either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And so they found that they used more than 10% of their brain, and it was closer to 80% of the brain being used. And you can imagine that was just such a simple task for the person just to sit there and look and then, you know, do thumbs up or thumbs down. Think about some of the more complicated tasks in which our bodies go through, like riding a bike, or sometimes we're constantly multitasking, right? So you're actively moving your body while you're thinking of something else, and I don't know, someone's tugging on you here or there, asking for a glass of milk, maybe your children, my children. Anyway, let's continue on. In your next video, we're going to talk about section 12.2.